you had this weird competition among tech CEOs about how little food they can subsist on. The most extreme example, I think, or one of the very extreme examples, was Elizabeth Holmes, who claimed to subsist on green juice, which nutritionists say is actually impossible to subsist on. But you also had people arguing about how little sleep they get, and then you also had things like infrared heat lamps and all of these kind of both ancient practices and kind of post-human practices to cultivate senses of otherness, to cultivate special powers. And I think they do believe it to some degree. I mean, in the same ways that we all have the intuitions that individuals who deviate from humanness, who engage in deprivation, cultivate these powers, I think they do as well. But there's also a very strong performative dimension.
Hi, welcome to Minds Over Matters. Today's guest is Dr. Manvir Singh. He's a writer and an anthropologist studying the origins of human behavior. His new book, Shamanism, The Timeless Religion, documents the origins of shamanism, and I think you're going to see a lot of correlation between common society and his work. Tell me a little bit about this, because I have read some of your work, and it blew my mind. I'd like to hear it from your perspective. Can you define shamanism as you see it?
For sure. So what exactly shamanism is has been debated for more than a century. The definition that I prefer is a simple one, where shamanism consists of three central features. Shamans are practitioners who, one, enter non-ordinary states: trance, ecstasy, hysteria. They've gone by many words, but the central thing is this kind of non-ordinary state. The second is that they're understood to engage with some kind of unseen reality or agent: gods, ghosts, witches, ancestors, local spirits. And then finally, through this non-ordinary states, through this engagement with the unseen, they provide services like healing and divination. So that I consider the core of shamanism. But then there are many features that we often see reliably co-occurring with those central features.
It's so interesting. Because, can anybody be a shaman? If I took enough ayahuasca, could I be a shaman? Could I emerge with superpowers? Or is that the general philosophy behind it? Or
yeah, I mean, so that is another thing that there's a lot of people debate over. My view is that if you exhibit these three features, then you're a shaman. There's a tendency sometimes to want to gatekeep. Oh, these are legitimate shamans. These are not. These are traditional. These are new. But I think all shamanic traditions, all traditions are dynamic. They involve self-invention. So I actually feel that if an individual exhibits these features, if they're entering these non-ordinary states, if they understand themselves to be engaging with unseen realities, and they're doing that for services, like, they're healing others or divining or whatnot, then I would say you could qualify as a shaman if you wanted.
Awesome. Career goals. If I ever that career change, I might have a new direction. Never know. So we talk a little bit about how that translates into the everyday. Because as you just kind of touched on, when I hear the word shaman, I think of witch doctor, kind of there's a very specific picture that emerges in my head that's painted from my personal histories, but it's a lot more ubiquitous than that, right? Yeah. And we can even think about the history of the study of shamanism. So shaman is a Siberian word. Maybe it comes from Sanskrit, but it entered European languages, Western European languages through Siberian languages. And so for a long time, shamanism was really associated with Siberia. Then in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, it started to be recognized that what we see in Siberia, we actually see all around the world. These specialists who are entering trance states, who are healing, divining, understanding themselves to engage with spirits, we see in Indonesia, we see in indigenous America, we see in Australia. And there started to be a recognition of, okay, maybe we can use this term outside of Siberia. Maybe, there are enough comparisons, enough parallels, enough patterns that justify the use more broadly. But because of that origin, because of that history, the term shamanism has baggage. Kind of what you were saying, it has baggage that is kind of primitivist, kind of exotic, kind of archaic, in some instances, kind of orientalist. But I think now that we have studied societies everywhere, we see shamanism both explicitly and its echoes, whiffs of shamanism, ubiquitously all over the world. So some examples. In Western industrialized societies, arguably the fastest growing religion is Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. Now, if it were any other tradition, it would be, I think many people would much more easily regard elements of it as shamanic. You have
pastors who are entering non-ordinary states. They're speaking in tongues. They are healing people. They are understanding themselves to commune with a God. I mean, because of the particular history of Christianity, because of how, because of essentially its Western nature, and because it's built in this institutionalized religion, people are more apprehensive about calling it shamanic, but that, I think, is very explicitly shamanic. So there are kind of these explicit forms of shamanism. They also have like neo-shamans, but then there are also what we might call analogs of shamans or whiffs of shamanism. So one of my favorites are money managers. Now what money managers are doing is they are doing something very similar to shamans. They're promising control over a system that is arguably uncontrollable. There's been a lot of research for decades that shows that money managers don't reliably outcompete the market. There are like fun things where like chimpanzees will throw darts and produce portfolios that outcompete money managers. But it raises this question then of why are people going to money managers? And I think money managers are serving a very similar psychological function. People are confronted with a system that is very important, that is high stakes, but that is uncertain and ultimately uncontrollable. And they seek out authority to manage that uncertainty, to manage the uncontrollable in their lives. And it selects for this dynamic where money managers, experts, are competing amongst themselves to dress themselves essentially in costumes of credibility, these performances of charisma. There are many ways in which money managers seem to cultivate charisma, and different money managers actually seem to take different approaches. Some stress how much they work. We work 100-hour weeks. We are, incredibly hedonic, or we have these weird incentive structures. Others might emphasize that they have tools or backgrounds that allow them to discern the trends that are otherwise opaque to other people. There are all of these different badges or performances of credibility, but I think the dynamic is fundamentally very, very similar.
So something you just touched on, there are two directions for shamanism. There's those who profess to know more than the average person and who would offer such advice or guidance. There, on the other side, is the masses that are hungry for this information. Do you find that there's a receptivity to it? And it almost seems, from maybe my ill-informed position as a citizen of the United States, that there's an opportunity there to take advantage of people. But still, people are hungry for that guidance, whether it become from a money manager, from a horoscope, anything that professes to know what I can't know because of my limitations, and I acknowledge my limitations. Can you talk a little bit about that? For
sure. And I think you've really touched upon it. I like how you described it. So I think sometimes it's very easy to say that money managers exist because they're preying on people, they're exploitative, to really place it on them. But there's a dynamic here where it's both sides. Money managers exist, magicians exist, charismatic prophets exist because there is often a need for them. There is a desire to ultimately control the uncertain. And like you gestured at, I think that can be leveraged for ends that are sometimes exploitative and sometimes positive. And you see this in many societies. You see shamans, I think in many instances you have strong reasons to conclude that they are sources of therapeutic comfort. They probably leverage the placebo effect. They help transform patients' narratives about themselves. But you also see them being exploitative. I mean, there's a fun example I came across in an ethnography I was reading about. It was an ethnography from India where a shaman had possessed a widow's or was possessed by a widow's dead husband and said something like, as the dead husband, I really want to have sex with you, but to do that you have to have sex with this shaman.
Convenient.
Yeah, convenient. But I think that is it's kind of a quirky anecdote, but it reflects something more generally, where when these individuals have that power to change your story about themselves, when they have that authority, that credibility, they can use that for good, and they can also use it for more exploitative ends.
So just so I'm clear on this, the potential for this to actually be beneficial is there. I mean, even if it's just placebo effect, I mean, I guess if you were to get into more metaphysical things or more, M theory or string theory or something like that, where there's a determinism to the universe and I can manifest reality as I move through the whatever this is. There's an element of that, but there's also an element of danger, because as you just touched on, people could easily be taking advantage of it. Have you seen any data that shows benefits?
Yeah, so in my book, I have a chapter where I go through 3 mechanisms by which I think shamanism is providing therapeutic outcomes. And like you gestured at, I'm going to put aside right now the possibility that shamans are engaging with these spirits and through that engagement providing services, and maybe think about kind of other mechanisms. So there are 3 I point out. The first is the placebo effect, like we're talking about. And the really interesting thing about research on the placebo effect is that it shows that the placebo effect is strongest under 2 conditions. First, when there's an empathetic relationship with the practitioner, with the doctor. When you feel some kind of genuine emotional connection to this individual, then that can boost up the placebo effect. The second is that the more visceral the treatment, the stronger the placebo effect. So we see that, if someone has pain, and we can treat them with a sugar pill, we can put some kind of topical ointment on them, or we can do sham surgery where you manipulate their body and potentially it appears open them up. And what research seems to consistently find is that sham surgery produces a stronger effect than topical ointment, produces a stronger effect than sugar pills. And now, the reason I find this so interesting is that shamanism really ramps up both of these things. Shamanic interventions, as you see in many societies, are incredibly sensorially vivid. Music, touch, fire, performance, sometimes psychoactive substances. They are incredibly engrossing, dramatic experiences, and I think that has a very potentially large therapeutic opportunity. And then they're also very empathetic. They are often a part of the community. They know this individual. The second thing the second mechanism by which I think shamanism is often providing therapeutic benefits is by changing the story the patient has about themselves. And really interestingly, there's a lot of research on how this works in psychotherapy more generally, but I spoke to a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, Glenn Treisman. He runs the pain division. He's quite an eminent psychiatrist at Hopkins, and he works with patients specifically who have illnesses that other people have kind of given up on and who have chronic pain that other people often dismiss. So the people who come into his clinic or come into his practice are often people who have seen tens of doctors, for example, and they've been told, oh, you're making this up or whatever. And his practice is to first affirm their narrative. Okay, so not to say you're making this up, but there is a genuine illness here. There's a genuine kind of source of this. But then to what he calls putting on the bird head, to increase his sense of authority in their eyes and to help them change that narrative about themselves. And he showed me a video, and it's kind of goofy. He puts on a bow tie, he puts on a suit, he puts on cufflinks. He really beefs up this whole image of himself as both distinct from them, but also an authority. And through that says, I know you've seen many people. I am the I forget his exact title, the Eugene Meyer Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. I am here to fix your illness. I will get you to walk. And he showed me one of these videos where he tells the guy he's going to get him to walk, and he lifts him up. But I think that more generally is an example of the ways in which people who are understood to have power, who are understood to have authority, can change our stories about ourselves. Mm-hmm. They can help me think I am no longer broken. I'm no longer haunted by witches. This illness that was inside me is no longer persisting. So that is the second mechanism. Sorry, this is kind of a long answer.
Please go.
And then the final one, I think, is just the social. Shamanic healing ceremonies, maybe the thing that has been most striking about seeing ceremonies across cultures, and particularly in Indonesia where I work, is that they're incredibly social, communal events. An entire family, a large set of friends will come together. There will be dancing, there will be healing. After the healing is over, they'll continue dancing all night. It becomes a celebration. And I think, having grown up in the West, and particularly in we're both from New Jersey to some degree, I really associate healing with an attitude that is more solemn, that is more somber. But it's been really striking to see in Mentawai, and the communities I work with in Indonesia, how celebratory it is and how communal it is. And we know that social relationships and social connection are so important for even something like lifespan or health more generally. And so I think there's a strong reason to then conclude that just this aspect of shamanism itself has a really strong therapeutic outcome.
Interesting. Something I that really struck me when I was reading about your work. There are cultural embodiments. There are faces that are like lenses through which you can view this culturally, but this is not a cultural phenomenon. This is actually like a DNA programming, right? I mean, the ability of, or I should say the capacity for the average human being to be receptive to this. There's almost like a need baked into us, right? And it kind of transcends geography.
Yeah, the way that I think about it is that, all humans share this psychological substrate. And shamanism kind of emerges to fit itself to them. You can kind of think of it like taste. All humans share a similar taste system, and as we create culture, we all kind of tickle it in similar ways. We like, I don't know, sweets and dumplings. I'm not like a taste expert, but I think in a similar way, we share this kind of universal substrate, and then we reliably build shamanism to kind of appeal to that. Shamanism adapts to or conforms to our psychology. Is that clear?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So it's the same hydra. That's a pretty negative imagery, but it's the same hydra, just different heads, just different faces of it. The way it manifests throughout cultures, but the phenomenon itself is the same.
Yeah. The core is the same because it's speaking to a kind of universal basal psychology. But then, the manifestations can be manifold.
So do you find that there's a desire on the recipient's end? So if I go to see my neighborhood shaman, I go to see my neighborhood shaman, and I am looking to be healed for something. Is some of the underlying desire that I have in being open to this whole thing driven by the fact that I want what they have? Like I want to absorb their power. If they could teach me how to do this, I could rise to that level.
Oh, so you're saying, is a part of the appeal of going to a shaman essentially getting that power? Right.
Benefiting to become more self-aware. Like when people go to financial advisors,
yes.
They're going to get advice, yes, but sometimes they're going to learn themselves so that they can be more efficient in their own little marketplace.
Yeah. Well, so I think the motivations can be incredibly diverse. I think often the main motivation is kind of to get something out of that individual. Hey, I need healed illness. I need, I want some control over weather. But I think there are these other ones that you're talking about, and actually two that come to mind so I've done work in Indonesia, but also in Colombia, and I'll give you examples from each that seem to accord with what you're saying. So where I work in Indonesia, shamans are understood not only to, be these intermediaries who can heal you, etc., but to also have special knowledge. And people will sometimes go to shamans and they will pay them for sorcery knowledge. Someone has attacked me, how can I attack them back? Or someone has stolen my chickens, how can I find out who it is and make them sick? And so that is one example of people going to them. A very different form, though, that I found in Colombia, which I found really interesting, is so where we work in Colombia, or the communities we visited, the shamans enter trance through a psychedelic snuff, a hallucinogenic snuff called yopo. And what's really interesting is that yopo is often used to diagnose illness, to understand, the shamans will take it. They'll also take something called copy, Banisteriopsis copy, which is an MAOI and modulates the effects of the psychedelic. So they have this whole kind of shamanic intervention, but then really strikingly, we also found that they form these apprenticeships with non-shamans, where people will go to the shamans and they will have these relationships for years where they will take yopo together under the shaman's guidance, and they will use that to just cultivate wisdom, to understand reality. And we talked to a school teacher who has had one of these relationships with a shaman for many years. So this is among the Piaroa. They live on the border of Venezuela and Colombia, and then they also live more broadly in Venezuela. But yeah, he has had a relationship with a shaman for many years where they take yopo and he uses it to understand the nature of reality, understand himself, build relationships with the divine. So yeah, I think the relationships or the services or what people can get out of shamans can be very diverse. I do think the service is really important, but I think there are these other things as well.
And there's an element of this that I think some people who are more opportunistic have kind of tapped into, like positioning myself as a shaman. I think I've seen it in your work. You've alluded to, tech leaders, leaders in Fortune 500 companies who are like, I'm off. I'm a colorful character, and this is every morning I wake up at 4 o'clock and I meditate, and they are putting out this thing, whether it's legitimate or not. They're trying to create this perception that they are above, and that by extension their products will heal you or something like that. Do you see a lot of that globally?
Well, yeah. So I mean, as two people who live in California, I definitely see it over here, and I think it was especially popular kind of in the early 2020s, the late 2010s, where you had I wrote an article for Wired that then went into the book, where I called it the shamanification of tech CEOs, where you had an emphasis on these deprivation schemes. You had this weird competition among tech CEOs about how little food they can subsist on. The most extreme example, I think, or one of the very extreme examples, was Elizabeth Holmes, who claimed to subsist on green juice, which nutritionists say is actually impossible to subsist on. But you also had people arguing about how little sleep they get, and then you also had things like infrared heat lamps and all of these kind of both ancient practices and kind of post-human practices to cultivate senses of otherness, to cultivate special powers. And I think they do believe it to some degree. I mean, in the same ways that we all have the intuitions that individuals who deviate from humanness, who engage in deprivation, cultivate these powers, I think they do as well. But there's also a very strong performative dimension. And I think that's clearest just in how much, especially in the early 2020s and late 2010s, people were just talking about their deprivation schemes online. I talked to one CEO who was like, "Oh, I find it so distasteful how these other CEOs really use this to build their brand." And I found that ironic because he actually had on LinkedIn stuff about his fasting scheme. But I think you have that in many instances. I mean, I think shamanism, as all human behavior is complicated and involves a combination of performance and kind of sincerity. And I think just as much as you see that in tech CEO, you see that across cultures. You see a more complicated relationship with belief, with sincerity, with performance, where it's not just exploitative or performative, but also not only kind of absence of it.
So if I am out there in the audience listening to this podcast and I want to try on, talk me through what guidelines what am I looking for in I don't want to say a spiritual leader, because it doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual, but in a healer. Because I've seen historically a lot of abuse of this type of mentality, like I declare my superiority over you, therefore give me your money or whatever, or have sex with this body that I'm inhabiting or something like that. There's definitely that puts me on my guard, puts me on my back feet. But there's a benefit to be had in certain situations. How do I navigate that as a general Joe, just a consumer out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a big question, because I think that's actually what society is struggling with more generally. How do we engage with authority and expertise? I mean, you see a big backlash against expertise, and I think that's partly because people are themselves trying to figure this out. In what instances do you give over the opportunity for others to make decisions over yourselves, and in what circumstances should you be more protective? I don't know if I can offer a real simple answer. What I'll say, I think, cross-culturally is what are the constraints on the power of the expert or the leader or the shaman? I mean, the reason, just to kind of use a very extreme contrast, the reason Sam Bankman-Fried was able to, and I use him as an example because he also very deliberately cultivated this whole vibe. After FTX went down, it came out that his entire, he always had this messy hair, and that was actually a very deliberately orchestrated thing to promote the sense of himself as kind of schlubby. But Sam Bankman-Fried had an immense amount of power and money, and I think that allowed him to leverage that for pretty exploitative ends. And so I think, as with all power and expertise, curbing the opportunity for others to leverage it for their selfish ends just allows you to trust them more. Do you know what I mean? In contexts where relations are more egalitarian. So I think of trans healing among the Kalahari Kung. This is a very well-studied phenomenon in Southern Africa. It's a really egalitarian shamanic institution. And I think it is very strongly therapeutic, but there are also very few opportunities for people to leverage that authority to be exploitative or extractive. And so the same conditions that I think allow leaders to take advantage of other people also apply to thinking about spiritual leadership.
So I'm hearing, if I were to boil it down to one principle, it could be risk. What do you risk by investing in this, by believing in it? If there's an opportunity for you to, cause I've got to think that a true healer doesn't actually need money, like their gift comes from beyond this realm, or at least that's the magical theory behind it. Therefore their benefits should be free because they're just a conduit. Does that sound legitimate?
Well, I mean, I think that's an intuition that you find often across cultures where it's like, if you want to be a healer or if you want to be a spiritual authority, you have to give something up. And I think that's partly because you want to cultivate power, but also you don't want to give another individual all of this opportunity to take advantage of you. And there's also, I think, something more assuring about an individual who seems to be working for you rather than working for themselves. I'll say it's complicated. So where I work, again, with the Mentawai in Indonesia, there's this thing about you don't pay shamans. But what you do is that when the shamans come and they heal you, you sacrifice animals and you share that meat, but with the shamans, but also with everyone in attendance, and the shamans get the best pieces, and there's kind of an implicit understanding that that is a form of payment. So again, it's like, you're always walking this tricky tightrope.
Right. And so that's the cultural interpretation of what that currency is like, which is incredibly, well, I think it's acceptable. I think if it's like, I'm going to need your house, I'll heal you, but I'm going to need you to move out because I need your room for my stuff or whatever. You're like, that's a pretty clear line, I think, to draw. And I know that there's a lot of this mentality. First of all, I have to say, when I first read about your work, I saw it everywhere. I saw shamanism in like everywhere but the mirror, but I mean, every time I look at social media, I see an element of it somewhere. I see, even like newscasts or influencers. Just the concept of an influencer is like, I'm a person who's doing the legwork. I've got superiority. I listen to my opinion because it's worth more than your experience, kind of a thing. Or I'm doing what you can't do. There are like shades of this everywhere. It's pervasive in our culture. Do you find it equally as pervasive everywhere else, or have we just really tapped into it because we're capitalists?
I think it's ubiquitous. And the thing is that, again, I think shamanism is reflecting a more basic or fundamental aspect of expertise, leadership, charisma. I mean, I think that the central thing about shamanism, the really important critical feature of it, is the sense that being other, deviating from normal humanness, gives you special insight or power. That is what so much of shamanism is about. I think that's pretty important. I don't think that's all of altered states. I think a lot of shamanic dramatic initiations, cutting apart the body, putting in crystals, death and rebirth initiations, are really about this sense that this is a different kind of human, and thus they have this power or authority that they claim. If for example you came to me and you're like, "Hey Manvir, can you talk to the sky god and stop the rain?" And I'm like, "Sure." You would be skeptical. I'm like a regular guy. Mm-hmm. But if you had understood that, I had gone through this dramatic initiation and you cut open my body and there are crystals inside, and when I did talk to the sky god, I kind of entered this dissociated state and was speaking in a different language, and there's frothing at the mouth, and that makes it more credible that I have these special abilities. Now, that's a very long example, but I mentioned that to say that I think this is really critical just for how we think about special powers and leadership and charisma more generally. When we are looking for people to do the miraculous, or when we are looking for people to give us guidance, we are often also looking for performances that they are not simple humans, that they have had early life experiences that transform how they engage with the world, that they are fundamentally different and thus can speak to these things. And so when you say that you see this all around the world, or all around your social media feed, I think that's because that is just more generally how people often think about charisma.
So I'm curious about, how did you start this? Like what brought you into this realization and into this line of study?
Yeah, so My interest in shamanism started a little more than a decade ago. I was a PhD student looking for a place to do research. I had decided to go to this archipelago off the west coast of Indonesia, the Mentawai Islands. Some of your viewers might know it because it's also like one of the best places in the world to surf. And it's actually because it's all the way on the east part of the Indian Ocean. So it's about as far west as you can go in Indonesia, but it's on the edge of the Indian Ocean, so you have these massive swells that break. But anyway, I went to the Mentawai Islands because I was interested in a place where there is a strong indigenous religious tradition, where there are institutions for managing conflict. I was really interested and continue to be interested in justice. And so I get to Siberut, and immediately I am struck with these individuals who are known as Sikere. And the Sikere are really salient among the Mentawai. They are often tattooed. Much of their body is tattooed. They still almost exclusively wear loincloths, or many of them still wear loincloths. They grow long hair. During ceremonies, they cover their bodies in turmeric. They wear feathers, they wear beads, they wear leaves. And so they're first very visually salient. They're also very socially salient. You can kind of feel, a Sikere walks into a room and then you can feel the social gravity kind of bend towards them. But then finally, they're really just socially significant. They are at the center of ritual life, of spiritual life, of religious life, but also political life, medicinal life. So there were these incredibly prestigious individuals. And so that first summer, I was just really astounded by them. I was like, what is this institution? And I would see glimmers of it. I would see, we would walk by and I would see a ceremony going on, and I would hear their singing, I would hear the bells, I would see patients. And so I was just super intrigued. And so then I got home, and I wanted to learn more about the Sikere institution, and learned that it is actually, it echoes these traditions that you find across cultures. That what I had found in Siberut and among the Mentawai was obviously very much a product of its cultural context, but that it had these very intriguing parallels. And that's how I started to read up more on shamanism. I think before I had a sense of shamanism that is like pretty similar to like how the public more generally thinks about it. I knew it was associated with trance states. Maybe I thought it involved hallucinogens to a great degree. I myself had a kind of primitivist association with it. I thought of it as like something exotic and from the deep past. But then I started to read more on it, started to engage with work on its psychology, and then I started to really appreciate how it had, kind of like you were saying, these interesting resonances in my daily experience and all around me.
So did you see anything quantitatively or qualitatively that lit you up, that just said this is an aspirational way of living, or this is like some kind of microcosm of the superstructure of humanity and society, the way we all interact? I can see it all in this one small group, like every element is represented here.
Well, I would say that I was constantly looking for analogs. So like I get to this society, I have these individuals, and how do I think about it? I need some kind of framework to think about them. Are they like doctors? Are they like priests? Are they like storytellers? I found that I kept looking for a framework to think about them and kept struggling to have that framework. I would say that was the kind of prevailing experience. Okay.
So they are kind of all the good, or all the aspirational.
I had a complicated view of them. I wondered whether, and this kind of echoes the whole thing we're talking about. They're providing services, but to what extent are they also kind of protecting a monopoly, guarding their jurisdiction, ensuring that only some people can become Sikere, making themselves scarce? So I would say that they were very salient, they were very significant, but my view of them was not like monolithically positive.
Okay. They just are.
They're like all humans, They're kind of complicated in their nature.
Did you see any analogs that from United States culture that reflected in that?
Well, so I would say it was kind of like, okay, should I think of them as like a profession that is like kind of racketeering? And then I was like, I don't think that really works as much as I thought. Should I think about them as priests? But ultimately, I think what happened is that it kind of flipped. in the beginning I was like, what are the Western analogs that help me understand shamanism? Ultimately, I think it was like my engagement with shamanism has given me a real understanding for this phenomenon in this context and cross-culturally. How does that now transform how I think about these Western analogs? So there's this formulation about anthropology that I love, that by studying diverse cultures, it turns the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And so by studying shamanism among the Mentawai and across cultures, it really transformed how I think about, contexts more familiar to me, whether that's money managers or tech CEOs or politicians, charismatic Christian pastors. I started to then see these things not as necessarily, exceptional, peculiar things about modern Western society, but as echoing or resonating with tendencies that we see across culturally all throughout history.
So like elements of a recipe kind of a thing. Like here's an ingredient, here's an ingredient, here's an ingredient. They happen to have this collection of it. I see these ingredients present in other cultures, but maybe not in the same order or the same dimensions or something, or sometimes they're lacking. So I think I get what you're saying. It's there. There are some commonalities, and then but the way that they are bound is not necessarily identical culture to culture or place to place.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, I think that is the great strength, or one of the great strengths of anthropology. You can study, for example, witchcraft across societies, and then get greater insight into like the demonizing narratives that we might see on a daily basis, or you might study myth or power or magic, and start to understand other aspects of society that may have otherwise seemed exceptional and kind of absent of some kind of cross-cultural resonance.
Is there a historical element to your research? I mean, do you look back at time and say this is the way cultures used to be?
I mean, I have a big historical dimension of my research that partly intersects with shamanism, but then also very much outside of it. So yeah, I mean, I've been very interested in like how deep is shamanism, but then I also am very interested in like what did human societies look like for the last 200,000 years. I mean, that's kind of a separate research interest of mine.
Sure. I mean, like I've always wondered about evolution or time's impact on people. Around our collective intelligence, around our unique individual emotional intelligence. Are we becoming more savvy over time, or are we becoming more gullible? Or where do we lie? I know there's that shamanistic myth of like Atlantis that's out there, like, oh, there was a perfect society and it went into the ocean. Like, oh, now we got to chase this perfect society down, figure out how they did what they did so that we can kind of emulate that. I'm curious what time has to say about this. If it increases the recipient's tendencies toward accepting shaman or actually seeking healers.
Well, I think that's a good question.
Good.
Well, because when I hear people talk about shamanism, I often see it framed in one of two discussions. One is what I call superstitious savagery, and it's this idea that shamanism is a kind of a relic of a backwards era. It's a time when we were superstitious and gullible, and now we're enlightened and we're rational and we're scientific. I think that's one narrative. And then another is what I call primeval wisdom, this idea that we were once connected to nature. We once had wisdom. We once were wise and egalitarian and kind of more positive in our social interactions with each other and with the world, and that has really declined and degraded. And I mean, I think these are claims about shamanism, but I think there are also claims more generally about modernity. Is modernity something to be lauded, or is it something to be, is it something negative and to be transformed and to be, is it a fundamental flaw or mistake? And my study with shamanism has, if anything, taught me that this debate is a hollow one. It's shamanism is not primeval wisdom. It's not superstitious savagery. It is this like resonant tendency that humans are always savvy to some degree. They're always gullible to some degree. That I less thinking either of like a grand increase in wisdom or decline in wisdom. I think it's that our psychology is always leading us in to resurrect cultural traditions even when we deny that we are doing so.
Yeah, that's thank you for that, because that clears up a lot. That helps me to understand this over time and writ large. Physiologically, can you trace this behavior back to a section of the brain so that you know like when it came about during our evolution?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think so.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's a big question of like how long have we been religious and how long have we been animistic and how long have we had shamanism, and it's hard to say. And I think like figuring out what the cognitive capacities underlying it and when they evolved is really critical for answering that question, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, and I'm thinking like looking at a time scale, you know, sometimes traits fade away when they're no longer necessary or when they actually create a risk that's unnecessarily, those traits tend to disappear pretty quickly in evolution. And I'm wondering, this has clearly been around for a long, long, long time. But then again, you know, so has fight or flight. That's like located in the center of our brain, in our limbic system, that thing that makes us aggressive. Most often not necessary, you know, unnecessarily so. I'm wondering where this falls in that. Like, can you see a future? Would you want to see a future where this tendency to seek guidance from someone you believe to be superior fades away?
Yeah, so my book is called Shamanism, the Timeless Religion, and the reason is that I think it's like a perennial tendency. It's eternal. There can often be these narratives about a disenchantment of the world, about how we're becoming rational, but I think this is such a deep impulse of humanity, and I think that the way that we construct culture is for it to be so incredibly compelling that I think we will continue to do so for as long as we'll be human.
In your estimation, in your experience, is there a hierarchy within shamanism? Is there a tendency to say you didn't make the cut? You know, like is there like you're not shaman material in any culture? Is that
for sure? Yeah, constantly. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of like who is legitimate and who is not, and there's a constant judging of whether you are. So I mean, again, with the Mentawe, I've counted how many ceremonies each shaman is called, and there's one shaman who's called to like a third of ceremonies, and then the next is called to like around 15%, and then everyone after that is called to like 2%. And people won't say this explicitly, but it's very much like he's the best shaman. This other guy is like related to him, so we have to call him sometimes, and then everyone else is fine. That in that context, it's kind of implicit, but it can also be pretty explicit. And kind of related to that, something I think is interesting with shamanism is that, so shamans I think can sometimes be individuals who have traits that would maybe otherwise lead them to be outcasts. Shamans are sometimes individuals who have other fingers or who are maybe a bit epileptic or enter these dissociated states or might be a little psychologically peculiar. And I think a shamanic institution recasts these forms of otherness as like sources of expertise and power and credibility.
Okay, so look for this trait that this shaman has because they're the high achiever.
Yeah, and it's very culturally constituted. So like, in some societies having an extra finger can be important as a grounds for being a shaman. In many societies, that's not relevant. In some societies, it might be, were you born in your amniotic sac or something? In other societies, again, that's not very relevant. So the dimensions of otherness really vary across societies, but it can be this way of recasting otherness as spiritual authority.
Okay, and so that seems to be more culturally specific, you say?
Yeah, I would say that the phenomenon of otherness being a grounds for spiritual authority is common, but exactly what form of otherness is relevant, I would say, is more culturally.
Gotcha. Okay.
Diverse.
So you refer to shamanism as a cognitive technology. Can you expand on that a little bit?
For sure. I mean, I think of it as a technology, and in particular as a cognitive technology. So what I think is really powerful about shamanism is that it is adapting to people's psychologies. It's a technology that kind of creates a simulated experience that touches people's cognitive buttons to provide them with this sense of control. And again, I think this links to something we're talking about, which is like all technologies, I think shamanism can be used for good and for bad. Sometimes people, really linking on what we're talking about, sometimes people or ask me, is shamanism good or bad? Is it some is it a source of therapy? Is it something we should want, or is it something we should try to get rid of. And I think like all technologies, its effects really depend on who is deploying it and what is the moral lens we're using to evaluate it.
So we touched a little bit about the history of shamanism. We get into the origins. You've spent some time in France in caves looking at cave paintings. Have you seen anything that belies that this existed back then?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that there are many claims that there is rock art, there's cave art that represents early shamanism. There's claims that what are called therianthropes, these human-animal hybrids, might be shamans, or they might have been produced by shamans. There's a whole rock art theory of shamanism. And so I did my postdoc in France, and there's a cave over there. Translated into English, it would be the Cave of Three Brothers. And the Cave of Three Brothers has a figure in it called le chaman, or le sorcier, the shaman or the sorcerer. And it is from about 16,000 years ago. It's a painted figure of a human-animal hybrid, mostly many animals. There's maybe features of a bear. There is a claim that it has deer antlers. It might have the face of an owl, the horse of a tail. And so, I was in France and I wanted to go see this art and get a sense of, can we actually infer shamanism from this? And so getting to that cave is a bit tricky. The cave is owned, actually, so it was discovered by three brothers and their father, and it's owned by that family still. And so I, through a really great contact, got in touch with one of those discoverers' sons, who's now in his late 70s or early 80s. And he took me and a friend and one of my friend's colleagues into the cave. And we climbed down into this cave. And this is an largely untouched cave. It's only available to researchers, or only open to researchers, and a couple every year. And so it's really, really striking. The rock art is amazing, but also actually one thing that is also amazing is all just like the weird things that prehistoric humans did when they were walking around this cave. So you often see like little pieces of stone slipped into the sides, where I guess humans were like, that would be cool. But so anyway, we go down, we're traveling this cave, and he takes us into the room called the sanctuary. The sanctuary is an amazing room. The walls are covered with carvings. A lot of bison, a lot of horses, a lot of these hoofed animals, ungulates. There's also, interestingly, an enormous penis on the wall. There's a face. So you have all of that. And then you have le chaman, or le sorcier, above. And it's clearly a really special figure to them. It's one of only two hybrids in the room, but it also hovers above them. And everything else is carved, but this is also painted. And so, I wanted to see it. And the conclusion I came away from that room is the same conclusion that I had beforehand, and which I have now, which is that it's cool, it's intriguing. Humans were clearly imaginative. It's very hard to infer shamanism from that. And so my own engagement with the research on the prehistory of shamanism is that humans have clearly been imaginative, spiritual, mythological for a long time, but it's very hard to be confident from archaeology that there has been shamanism. And so I instead have looked to other approaches, trying to think about what are the psychological building blocks and when have they emerged, and if shamanism is ubiquitous now, what does that mean? And that's led me to think that more generally, kind of the theme of our conversation, that humans just redevelop shamanism so easily. And so as long as we've been at least psychologically modern, as long as humans have had minds like us, I would have expected them to have shamanism. Now, there's debate how long that's been, but it's at least been 50,000, 100,000 years. So I personally think shamanism has been around for a very long time, but I don't think it's because of the evidence that people normally point to.
Yeah, and it's hard to look at a wall that actually has penis graffiti and say, okay, these are on equal footing. Like, is it a shaman or is it graffiti? I don't know. It could be somebody's learned how to draw a character, and that's my brand now. So that's interesting, though. That's really interesting. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to throw in?
Well, one final thing, just on shamanism, is that I think sometimes historically, on your historical note, people can think of shamanism as kind of like a proto-religion. You've probably seen that illustration, the March of the Progress of Man, or the Evolution of Man, where you have like a chimpanzee-like creature, and then it evolves into a walking Homo sapiens. I think people can sometimes kind of think of shamanism as that early ape, this kind of earlier phase of religious evolution. And my research on shamanism has actually led me to think of it more as shamanism and centralized religion. It's not that one becomes the other, but it's that centralizing tendencies and ecstatic tendencies have a constant tug of war throughout religious evolution and history. You can see this in Christianity. Christianity started super ecstatic. The day of Pentecost, everyone speaking in tongues and healing it and whatnot. But then the church really clamps down on that. And I think so much of the history of Christianity is precisely that. It's that you have these ecstatic offshoots where the divine is kind of more intimate and there's a lot of healing. There's more local charisma, and then you have an attempt to clamp down on it. So the point, just more generally, is that rather than thinking of shamanism as a proto-religion, I think of it as this hyper-compelling tendency that centralizing forces are constantly in tension with.
Sincerest thanks to our guest, Manvir Singh. If you'd like to learn more about Manvir and his work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everybody. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening. See you next time.